Esca ma hol dinge. I'm Mirvis of College of Economy on the Hill. Good evening, everybody. I'm really delighted to be with you this evening. We've got quite a small meeting this evening, and we have got quite a lot more people registered. But I think what we'll do is we'll kick off, and then others can join. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Sally Reynolds, and I'm one of the Scottish Land Commissioners, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's session. And I'll just kick off with a little bit of housekeeping. The most important thing to note is that the session will be recorded. So if you would like to turn your cameras off, please do. It's deliberately a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar because we want it to be interactive. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions and interact. So I'm joined this evening on the panel by Andrew Thynne, who's also a Land Commissioner, and he's the chair of the Scottish Land Commissioner, by Professor David Adams, who's one of the other commissioners as well, and by David Stewart, who is our policy and practice lead. And I will be coming to each of them following the presentation, just to introduce themselves. So the format of the evening will be that I'll pass to Andrew and he'll give us a presentation. Then we'll have an introduction from David Adams and David Stewart just on their areas of specialism, because they're very appropriate to the area that we're with you tonight. Now, there is a privacy notice and the link will be in the chat, so please do check that if you have any issues. If you don't want to ask a question live, please feel free to use the chat box. Please use it to chat amongst yourselves or ask questions. That's absolutely fine. Now, at the end of the session, we'll be putting up a survey link. It's really important to us to get feedback on how the meeting has worked, whether it's worked or not. So, for example, tonight, we've had a lower attendance than normal, so it'd be really good to find out whether that's just because it happens to be the wrong night, clash of other meetings, or if there's another reason for that. So we can only make things better if you let us know how to make it better, so please do. As always, I'll say we don't have all the answers. I think you're probably right with that, Maggie. I think possibly World Cup being on the telly is probably a good, probably the answer there. As I'll always say, we don't have all the answers. We will, try and answer as best we can. But the most important thing for us at these meetings is to listen and to find out what's going on in your area. So, for example, I come from an island off the northwest coast of Scotland. I work for a community landowner. I'm entrenched in land reform day in, day out. But it may not be the same issues as you're experiencing in your area. I imagine there's lots of parallels, and we always find that, but there'll also be lots of differences. So for me, I just want to find out what's important in your area. So just to reiterate that please do speak out, and we are here to listen and to learn. I'm going to pass to Andrew now, and he's going to give a presentation that gives a bit of an overview about the Land Commission and what we're all about. Over to you, Andrew.
Sorry, Sally, I'm just getting the slideshow up and running, and then we're going to go.
Thanks, Andrew. And I omitted to mention the really, really important other person that's with us tonight, which is Jess, who you can't see. She is the sports staff in the background, and she's the most important person tonight because she's going to be keeping us right and putting everything up in the chat. So a big thanks to Jess.
Huge thanks to Jess. Actually, we simply couldn't do this without Jess. She's a real star. So my name is Andrew Thynne, currently chair of the Land Commission. I'm going to talk about 15 minutes. But my purpose really is to sort of set the scene a wee bit, maybe possibly provoke you a wee bit, and really to create the context for a discussion. So I hope we will have a discussion. The value of these events is that we get feedback about what the people of Scotland think we should be doing or shouldn't be doing, which is right. We're public servants, we should be held to account. That's absolutely right. And crucially, these monthly events, we hold them every month, they shape the forward work plan, because what people say to us then shapes what we try and do going forward. So the conversation we have after this presentation will be very important. I'm going to try and do two things. One is just say a little bit about what land reform is, because I think people often are a bit unclear about that. And secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about what we are doing at the moment. But that's not necessarily what we'll be doing in a year or two's time. And what we'll be doing in a year or two's time depends on what people say to us. So let's just have a wee think about what land reform is. So most people know, I think, that Scotland is dominated by very big landholdings. We have the most concentrated pattern of land ownership in Western Europe. About 450 people own half of Scotland's land, which is astonishing, because if land was equally spread, then 2.5 million people would own half of Scotland's land. So, that's a remarkable level of concentration. Now, I think people know that, and successive governments in Scotland since 1999, when the Parliament was created, have said very clearly, look, we need to diversify this pattern of land ownership. So I think that is quite well known. Also, probably well known is the fact that land reform is something to do with tenancies and tenant farming and crofting, which are both forms of tenancy. And certainly land reform legislation over the last 20 years has particularly emphasized, actually, reform of tenant farming legislation and reform of crofting legislation. It's questionable whether it's been entirely successful with crofting legislation, but it probably has been more successful with tenant farming legislation. So those are probably the well-known bits about land reform, but let's think about the less well-known bits and the things that are going to come along over the next few years. So no question, I think, that land management and land ownership for carbon sequestration is going to be a big issue. It already is a big issue. It's going to be a big issue in land ownership and land reform going forward. It's already the case that big speculative investors are buying up huge scalps of Scotland in order to sequester carbon and offset emissions from elsewhere. Now, you can tell me what you think of that. I have my own views, but I'll keep them to myself. But no question that that's what's happening. No question, therefore, that we need to deal with it. So that's a big land reform challenge going forward. It's a big land reform challenge already. The value of some of these upland peat bogs, which were previously worth next to nothing, has doubled, trebled, quadrupled in the last year or so as speculative investors come piling in. And quite big reputable investments, big brewery, big insurance companies, all piling in. So that's a big issue going forward. Another big issue now and going forward is the fact that Scotland has an appalling amount of vacant and derelict land, which frankly, in many places is a blight on people's lives. I spent 8 years working in Glasgow's General Scottish Canals, and the canals go through areas of vacant and derelict land in West Scotland and elsewhere. And people told me again and again, this is crazy. People are sitting on this land, doing absolutely nothing with it. Often public owners. I'm not talking necessarily about private owners. While it blights the lives of people living round about. So dealing with that, turning into something useful, that's a skateboard park or a BMX park, depending on what you like doing, built on a previously vacant site. And there's a lot more that needs to happen there. The whole business of land use planning and compulsion, the extent to which we use compulsion is I think, a big issue of the next decade. In many other parts of Europe, it's local government that decides how land is going to be used. In Scotland, by and large, landowners decide what they want to do, and then they apply for planning permission. It's the other way around. And the extent to which, in fact, the public interest might become more dominant going forward, I think is really important. And that might well, for example, we've already made recommendations that where land is left vacant and derelict and wrecking people's lives, there should be a compulsory power available to local authorities to force the owner to sell it rather than just sitting on it as a speculator. And there are many other things that could be done. The access legislation is one of Scotland's great triumphs, I think. It came in 2003. It put us in many ways at the front of land reform in Europe, alongside Norway probably. But there's big challenges coming, and nobody in 2003 thought about paddleboards. How are we going to deal with that? Nobody thought about electric bikes. So there will be further challenges around access, but it is a success story. Community ownership is another success story. 75% of the Western Isles are owned by the communities that live on that land. Salé is one of them. And some of the things that people like Salé are achieving as a result of that are quite extraordinary. But community ownership doesn't have to be just about land, and it doesn't just have to be about the Highlands or anything else. It can be about urban environments and all the rest of it. And in fact, we are now seeing communities not just buying land, but buying, as shown in the slide there, public toilets, buildings, bridges, cinemas, all sorts of things. It's an enormously empowering thing. And it, in many cases, it has enabled communities to take over assets that local government was simply no longer able to run for various reasons to do with, which you're all aware of, shortage of public money. So, and I think that will continue to be a really powerful force. And I hope it will become more powerful in places like Renfrewshire, southwest Scotland, southeast Scotland actually too, where it has been perhaps less of a focus so far. Another area, the whole idea of how do we own land in Scotland is quite narrow. You either own it or you rent it, or those are about your options really. In other parts of Europe, you have quite multi-layered structures where different people can own different rights in the same piece of land. And that's like my granny's hut. And some of you will know or have heard of the hutting movement that was quite a big issue in parts of West Central Scotland, Lanarkshire and so on, really probably from the Second World War onwards, or well, in some cases the First World War onwards. It fizzled out because the tenure arrangements were on the whole not robust enough. And to illustrate that, my granny, the landlord came along one day and said, I want a 1,000% increase in the rent. And my granny said, I can't afford that. And so he put a match to it. And he had the power to do that, still rankles with me. But it was a great movement at its time. Tax and financial support. Well, we've already looked at this a wee bit. There's a lot more. Landowner said to me recently, well, actually, the main reason I own land is to shelter my money from tax, which was very honest of him, I have to say. But 53% of the nation's wealth is held in the form of land. And we need to think about whether we tax that fairly at the moment. And if not, what should we do? We've done some work on that. We've published it already. There's more that could be done. And lastly, but probably one of the biggest issues of the day, certainly for my children's generation, and pretty much all throughout Scotland, everyone thinks that it's a problem of their area, but it's actually a problem of the whole of Scotland. We simply don't have enough houses at a price that is reasonable. Part of the reason for that is that while the price of building a house has broadly gone up in line with inflation, the price of buying a piece of land to put the house on has rocketed up way ahead of inflation over the last 25 years. So we've published work on that, which as it happens, links back to one of my earlier slides, because we've said, look, actually, sitting around and waiting for landowners to tell us where they want to build houses is not the way to do this. Other countries in other parts of Europe don't do that. They tell landowners where we're going to build houses. And that's what we mean by a public interest-led approach to development. So, and I think, my view is that we're going to have to bite those bullets much more firmly. So, Scottish Land Commission, we were established by Parliament just a few years ago. Our job is to provide advice and recommendations to government on changes to the law, and we certainly do that, but on changes to policy and wider change. We among other things, we advise landowners on how they ought to be behaving, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. We're a national organisation, which sounds very grand. Actually, we're also a tiny wee organisation. We've only got a dozen or so staff, so we're very small, but we've got a dozen or so incredibly clever people, economists and all the rest of it, and they think the unthinkable and come up with tremendous ideas. We are an we're an innovator, we're a kind of think tank, if you like. And of course, it's difficult. Scotland's a diverse country, and it's difficult sometimes to focus on the things that matter to folk in Kelso, because they probably don't matter to someone in Liverpool, or what matters to people in Renfrew, because it probably doesn't matter to somebody in St Andrews or whatever. So it's tricky, and that's why we hold these meetings, so that and why we go around geographically, so we understand properly the way in which different people in different parts of the country see all this. What are their needs? What are their fears? What are their hopes? Fundamental concept that was set out in 2016, and I think this is really important. Parliament said, look, we've really had enough of this focus on, it's my land. Well, it's also our land, thank you. And if you are going to own land rights, the right to do certain things in lands, then you also take on responsibilities to other people, to society as a whole. Right at the start of the Land Reform Act 2016, Part 1, that's a photograph of it actually at the bottom of that slide. It talks about land rights and responsibilities and what the government needs to do on that. And that phrase, with land rights go responsibilities, is probably one of the most important things that landowners need to understand. This is what we're working on at the moment. It's not what we'll be working on in 24 to 27, but from 20 to 23, we've been working on 3 things. And you should tell us, please, this evening what we should work on from 24 to 27. So over this 3 years, we've focused on, first of all, on land rights and on reforming what those rights might be. Secondly, because with land rights go responsibilities, we focus on, well, what does that look like? What does responsible look like? And how do we hold folk accountable? And thirdly, we're focused on the whole business of land markets and how those markets work, because of things like speculation and all the rest of it. So a wee bit more on these. So land rights, first of all. So one of the things that we have worked really hard on with limited success, I have to say, is to encourage more diverse pattern of ownership, to diversify that 450, so that, in 5 or 10 years' time, instead of 450 owning half of Scotland, it'll be, I don't know, double that or treble that or whatever. But that is difficult, but we are trying very hard. But we are also saying, look, it's not just about ownership. It could be about, if people can get a secure tenancy over a piece of land, that's probably just as useful, or nearly as useful anyway. So let's have more tenancies as well. New crofts, different kinds of tenant farms, other arrangements. There's a guy near me who's got a 99-year lease over a piece of land in order to run a little cheese dairy. There's different things that could be done. Secondly, we're looking at completely new ownership and governance models to widen who can be involved. I'll give you an example. Right this week, in fact, we were at a meeting involving the community on the island of Rum, together with the landowner, to discuss a new ownership and governance structure for that whole island, actually. Initially, it was about the castle on the island, but now for the whole island, where actually that might be a tripartite ownership structure involving perhaps a private charitable organisation, the Scottish people through the government or through Nature Scot or whatever, and the community through the community trust. So then, and I think over time we'll come up with more imaginative ways of doing it. They already do this much better in Norway and other countries. And thirdly, a big challenge which people often switch off at this point, and I can understand that, but it's a serious point. Under the human rights legislation, the right to the peaceful enjoyment of your property is a human right, and there's a lot of weight attached to that. The trouble with that is that it means that you are in effect able to purchase a human right, and therefore if you've got a deeper pocket or a bigger checkbook, you can purchase more human rights, and that can come into conflict with other human rights, other economic, social or cultural human rights. So trying to get that balance right. For example, someone owns a huge scalp of the southwest of Scotland on which are numerous tenant farmers, and that person might want to terminate a lease in order to plant trees. So whose rights should predominate in that? Because the tenant clearly also has economic, social and cultural rights, the right to a home and a living and all the rest of it. Tricky issues. And I want to say very little about the Land Reform Bill, but it's coming next year. But mainly as a consequence of a lot of work that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, government is now committed to publishing the Land Reform Bill and legislating in this Parliament specifically to try and help to address this issue of concentration of land ownership. There's been a big consultation. That's the Land Reform and the Net Zero Nations, what it was called. It's closed now. I hope you responded or got the chance. There's a range of proposals in there which are mainly about emphasizing and strengthening the emphasis on the responsibilities of large landowners, on controls, on power. The focus is on large landowners, and it includes, when large landholdings are changing hands, a public interest test as to whether in fact it's in the public interest for that to stay a big holding or maybe be broken up in some way. And that matter is not, it's not an arbitrary, they've suggested 3,000 hectares as the large size. It's not, frankly, it's not about some arbitrary figure. The issue is power. If you own a large amount of land, for example, around a community or a village, you have a lot of power over that place and you're not elected. And that's not necessarily in the public interest. We need to regulate that in the public interest. And more seriously, I think, in relation to land, an awful lot of people who own big land holdings have inherited those holdings. So they have therefore inherited their position and their power. They haven't got it because they've applied for a job and gone through a competitive interview and come out as the best person. They haven't got it because they've got lots of good relevant qualifications. They've got it because they were born there. And that's not necessarily a good thing either. So there are big challenges in here. Community ownership, I've said it's already a big issue, huge success in many ways. It's been developing since the early 90s. I was involved. Initially, it was mainly the people dipping into their pockets, crowdfunding, as it's called nowadays. Much more recently, the Scottish Land Fund, which is publicly funded, has become an important part of it. I've mentioned the Western Isles. It's all sorts of things. There are now in law community right to buy, that's what CRTB means, powers, but they're difficult to use because of the human rights. ECHR is the European Convention on Human Rights, because that does give constraints. It does give rights to people. You can't just walk in and help yourself to someone's land because you feel like it. And so we are also working, as I've said, on shared governance models where the community has some legal share. A wee bit about accountability and responsibility. It's based, as I said, on the whole concept of with land rights go responsibilities. We've published a raft of these protocols, tools, guidances, setting out, really spelling out, this is what responsible looks like. And if the government's current intentions on legislation come to pass, and I think they will, most of these protocols will become statutory codes for larger landowners, and therefore they will have significantly more teeth than they do now. In the meantime, we're working pretty hard with owners, with the people who advise those owners, with local communities and everyone else, to make sure that in the case of owners, they know what's expected, and in the case of communities, they know what they can expect. The Tenant Farming Commissioner is part of our team, Bob McIntosh. His job is to make sure that landowners and tenants have good relations and that they behave themselves. He publishes codes of practice which do have statutory underpinning. He provides mediation services, and he also is involved in supporting various new entrant schemes. I'm not going to dwell on that for the moment. And lastly, on reforming land markets, vacant and derelict land is a big issue, no question. We have had some success, I think, quite a lot of success actually, in energizing local government in particular to tackle this. There's still a long way to go. There's still a lot of vacant and derelict land. It's not always easy. Partly it's difficult because it's sometimes very expensive to deal with. It may be contaminated or whatever. Partly it's difficult to deal with because we don't have the right legal powers at the moment. Local government doesn't have the right legal powers. People can sit on it, speculators can sit on it, people can block access to it, all sorts of things. So there's more work to be done there, I think. But here's some examples of things that have been done recently. There's just very briefly, allotments on what was a vacant and derelict site. affordable housing on what was a vacant and derelict building in Inverness, Play Park in Glasgow on what was a vacant and derelict site, and clay pits in North Glasgow, which, although it doesn't look like it there, is now the most wonderful public park, but that was taken before it became wonderful. So we can do it. And a little on housing, as I said earlier, and David Stewart could talk further about this if you wish to later in the discussion. We think we need reform to address the way land's brought forward or not brought forward for housing. We need a more systematic, strategic, public system that's led, by the public interest. The sort of speculative model where we all sit in our hands and just hope that landowners will bring bits forward, and sometimes they'll sit in their hands and hope that prices will go up and all that kind of thing, is not delivering the results we need. What it's delivering is escalating prices for land for housing, prices that are escalating far faster than inflation, and that cannot possibly be in anybody's interest. Tax, a lot more we could do, no question of that. We think there are future options for taxing land value. As I say, 53% of the nation's wealth is held in land. And we think there are ways in which tax could be used to incentivize the use of land, including vacant and derelict land. More work to do there, I suspect. Carbon capture, natural capital, no question that there's going to be more work to be done here. Like it or not, the prices of these lands are soaring, speculators are pouring in. That could be a good thing. Let's not see this all as bad. If people are prepared to pour money into doing something, that could create jobs, and it could be good for Scotland, in particular for parts of rural Scotland that desperately need these jobs. But we need to be careful here, because what could happen is that outsiders use our land and pocket all the benefit, and off it goes. And local communities may benefit very little if we're not careful. So we've got to get this right. We've got to make sure it's responsible. Lastly, where can you get more information? This is a new hub we've set up in the last year or so. It's great fun. Please have a look at it, My Land Scott. Loads and loads of stories there about what people are doing already and how it's all working. So that's well worth it. And this is us. And please don't hesitate to contact us after this meeting if you want to. Don't hesitate. Particularly if you've got something to say that you don't want to say in a public forum, you want to say it in private, give us a shout. We'll give you a ring. Sally, that's enough from me, I think. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was a great overview. I never outlined at the beginning of the session our kind of finish time, so I was waiting to see how big a group will be. So I think, given the size of the group, we'll aim to wrap up by 8 p.m. At the latest. But if you do have any questions, please raise your hand or pop them in the chat box. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass to the two Davids in turn, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but I'm also just going to ask them to give a little bit of reflection on some relevant topics. So if we pass to David Stewart first, just ask David to do a wee introduction and just give us some reflections on some of the current work and looking forward on some of the housing work. So there's a couple of topics like the kind of transparency research and town centre living that it would be really nice to just hear a little bit more about. So I'll pass to you, David.
Thanks very much, Sally. Yes, hello everyone. I'm David Stewart and I'm a policy and practice lead. Following on from what Andrew was saying about the housing market not really meeting Scotland's needs, a couple of pieces of work we're doing at the moment. We've just commissioned research on transparency around land ownership, but also control over land. And what this is really looking at is trying to gain a better understanding of what information there is on where developers have options to build on sites, but they don't own the land. And as we understand it from previous research, it's quite hard to get a good understanding on that. And I think that matters because if communities and local authorities don't know where development might take place, then how do you have the discussion on where new homes should be built, the sort of development that should take place that's really in the best interests of a community? So we're going to investigate whether, in fact, there is a lack of information. We're going to look at some of the opportunities or benefits that are lost if there's a lack of clarity, and then hopefully make some recommendations on how there could be a register that was publicly accessible. The second piece of work that I'd like to mention that Sally touched on there is we're about to publish a report on town centre living alongside Scottish Features Trust and Architecture and Design Scotland. And it's really looking at, given that, as we all know, the role of the high streets changed and it's really declined with online shopping and the pandemic. But there's a big opportunity there, I think, to reuse either empty buildings or empty sites to develop housing, possibly for older people or for young people that's close to amenities, jobs and public transport. So this report, it will have a number of case studies, including Paisley Town Centre. It'll also make recommendations on what maybe needs to be changed to make town centre living more mainstream. Because really at the moment, for developers, there's a lot less risk in building on a greenfield site where there's one landowner. So if we're really going to encourage town centre living, I think we need to almost level the playing field, and whether that's through tax, incentives, or just, you know, tending to give planning permission more to urban areas. So yeah, these are two pieces of work that we're very much looking forward to publishing.
Thanks, David. That's great. And I'll pass now to David Adams. Now, David is one of the other commissioners, and I'll let David introduce himself. And I'll also just ask David if he could just give us some of his reflections on some of the vacant and derelict land work that we've done on the task force. So I think that's quite a relevant topic to this area. So it would be just nice to hear some of your reflections, David.
Thanks, Sally. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, thank you. So my interest in land reform is primarily, or not exclusively, in towns and cities in urban areas of Scotland. And I've been really pleased at the way in which the Commission has taken up the issue of land vacancy, dereliction, of which there is a huge amount, and particularly in West Central Scotland. And we did very considerable amount of work alongside a whole series of other stakeholders in the public, private and community sectors, and produced a very detailed report 2-3 years ago, setting out sort of 13 recommendations. And I think it's probably the first time for a very long time that an integrated and comprehensive roadmap was provided as to how this long-standing historic problem of vacancy and dereliction could be resolved. Now, of the 13 recommendations we set out, I mean, some have been taken up and some have not yet been taken up. But I think what perhaps we were most encouraged by was that report led to the Scottish Government taking the issue more seriously, and led to them creating a vacant and derelict land investment programme over 5 years. And the total sum of that investment programme is actually £50 million, which is a huge amount of money in terms of what can be done. And the first set of projects have been awarded, and those can all be circulated. But what it has done is sort of kickstart a whole number of projects across Scotland, and quite a lot in the West Central Scotland, that are going to bring back into use vacant derelict sites that otherwise would have remained in the condition they were. The work is work in progress. I think it's fair to say that there are some recommendations that are sort of fairly easy to take up and quick to take up, and others that might require legislation or might require more funding or work with other agencies. And I think it's important that we keep our eye on the issue and that everyone keeps their eye on the issue, because I suppose, just to conclude, that one of the reasons we have so much vacant and derelict land in Scotland is, for quite a long time, it was actually quite a forgotten issue and people didn't take it seriously enough. And I'm pleased to say that whereas it's not the Commission alone, the Commission has worked with a whole host of different stakeholders. I think it's fair to say the Commission has kick-started a new commitment in Scotland to tackle the issue. And I see that as a really important achievement of what we've been doing. Those in the area will have their stories or their case studies, but it is of particular interest to tonight's area, I think. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, David. That's great. And now I know we're quite a small group tonight, so if anyone would like to share questions, comments, please do wave at me, use your raise hand function, or pop something in the chat box. David Dunlop, would you like to come in, or did you just accidentally wave your hand?
No, I think it's a really excellent discussion. I've spent the last 30 odd years in urban regeneration, 15 years in the Paisley area, and been involved in my local community out in Renfrewshire, and I work within Glasgow. You know, so I'm not speaking as a Glasgow employee, but more as someone with a very general interest in land ownership, and particularly land which actually blocks progress within areas. I mean, it's this constant source of frustration that when regeneration projects are taking place, you're either getting somebody jumping in and buying land, or they're sitting on it for like 30 years. And the kind of penny drop recently with the idea that what seems to happen is that people buy land as a pension vehicle, and that you pay no tax on the land. You pay no tax, whereas a corner shop in Scotland pays what, £10,000 a year, and it just doesn't seem to make any sense. I think that it may well be that some owners have got kind of clear plans and ideas, but somewhere or other we always need to turn the heat up on certain owners to say, well, look, if you're not going to do anything with it, you're going to, for that benefit, you have to pay £10,000, £20,000 a year to focus your mind or sell it on. And it seems that public authorities are doing all the work. It also seems that this whole CPO process is incredibly convoluted. Public authorities got real issues in terms of securing the funds, and it's going to break down in terms of legal challenges, etc. And I think we need to really think about how we move areas forward. I mean, as I say, I work in Glasgow. I worked in industrial area regeneration for many years in and around Paisley, near Ferguson Park. There's a huge issue in terms of tracking down who owns the land. The valuation rules will tell you who you own it, but quite often you're then having into a company's house to try and find out contacts, and then it's somebody sitting in some English pension fund or some little corner in some kind of English town. And it's it's a constant source of frustration. I think it's something that we really need to get a grip of in Scotland.
Thanks, David. I'm going to actually ask each member of the panel to comment on that. But it's really nice to hear someone who works in this day to day, because these are the kind of things we talk about a lot. And it's really nice to hear someone who's in the nitty-gritty of it day to day. So I'm actually going to come to each of the panel and just ask them to just reflect a bit on what you're talking about, because there's a few things we can throw out there, a few different topics we can sort of talk about. I'm going to come to Andrew first. I know you've just hit on a couple of hobby horses for him, a couple of bits that he would like to talk about. Andrew and I, so Andrew is the chair of the commission, and part of the reason for us swapping roles in these is so that he can be a bit more controversial in what he says and gets an opportunity to share some more out there thinking. So Andrew, do you want to come back particularly on some of the kind of tax type stuff as well?
Oh, I'm never controversial, but yeah, David, thanks. Yeah, I mean, of course you're right. I spent 8 years chairing Scottish Canals and trying to assemble land to develop in North Glasgow with some success. I don't want to talk it down. We had some great successes, but my goodness, it was hard work. And you know, CPO was probably one of the most difficult things we tried to use. You know, for us, you know, simple little bits of land, which frankly, you know, it was just infuriating. So there's no question in my mind that we need to do two things. I think we do need to strengthen the regulatory tools, particularly that local government can use, rather than leaving, you know, I think this is the kind of thing that should be delegated down to local level. So local government needs stronger power. CPO, even if CPO works, you've got to find money. And right now that's going to be damn difficult. So I think what we said about compulsory sale orders was in the right direction. No question, and I do hope that's going to happen because we have recommended on that. But I think the principle is probably more important than the recommendation. The principle that if you own land rights and you don't exercise those rights responsibly, you may be forced by government to sell it. And I think that's a good principle, actually, because it is our land as well as your land. And if you're going to treat our land in that kind of cavalier manner, then you should expect to be forced to sell it. You'll be selling it at auction, so you'll get a fair price, but you'll be selling it. So that's a good principle. More generally, I think there's a whole heap of other regulatory tools. People like David Stewart and David Adams are far better at that than me. There was something else I was going to say, Sally, but I think I'll just pass on for the moment because I've now had a mental block on what else I was going to say.
Okay,
and I know you're running out of time.
No, you're fine. If it comes back to you, just come back in. I'll pass now to David Adams. Please feel free to pick up any of the topics there. I don't know if you want to expand more on compulsory sale orders, but it'd be just kind of interesting to hear some of your reflections on that. You're still on.
Right. No, it's told me to unmute, so I have done so. Yeah, I think there's a big issue here, which is land speculation. And people think, I mean, as David Dunlop says, that they might be able to get a return, or there might be an investment in holding onto land for 30 years and doing nothing with it. And that needs to be challenged head on. So as Andrew has said, we have recommended compulsory sale orders. We've also recommended on the taxation side that people should continue to pay non-domestic rates on newly derelict properties. So if people allow their land to go into dereliction, then they should have to pay rates. And that's an idea that could be extended much more widely once it comes in. I think what is also the case is we need to provide evidence that speculation is often fictitious and people's ideas of land value is not actually justified by any substantive evidence. And the problem with compulsory purchase, as well as all the resources and the time and the legalities that Andrew mentions, is that the compensation payable under compulsory purchase can often be quite fictitious. It actually can be much higher than what a productive piece of land is actually worth. So if we move towards compulsory sale orders, in other words, determining the value of vacant and derelict land in urban areas by a fair auction, it almost pricks the balloon. And you wouldn't need many auctions to start people realizing that the value that they thought something was worth and they were going to hold on for 30 years until they got it is probably not a good idea. So I think there's quite a few things, but the cultural perception that you can hold on to land and do nothing with it, as Andrew said, is being irresponsible, and that needs to be, one way or another, it needs to be not complete on the head. I mean, I must say, alongside that, there are plenty of landowners who actually do something with their land and do transform dereliction into productivity. And they actually are listening to the others and show that things can be done. We've recommended quite a number of things, and I think there's more things that could be done. And this is, as I said, it's work in progress.
Thanks, David. And this always comes back to the land rights and responsibility statement, and this is quite a good way of kind of showing that that's relevant right across Scotland, because I think sometimes it's thought of in the kind of big estate rural example, but this shows that with your land rights come responsibilities. So we may see changes with that going forward, which would be another kind of statutory way, a regulatory way of helping to tackle some of this. I'm going to come finally to David Stewart, and I think, David, again, please feel free to reflect on any of that you'd like to, but I did wonder if this, if there was something here to do with your kind of assembling land for development work as well.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, that was really exactly what I was going to say. I think it's a particularly relevant question because the fourth national planning framework's just going through Parliament at the moment, as you'll know, David, and it very much emphasises a move to development on brownfield land and in town centres, and moving away from developing greenfield sites and farmland. But actually, if that's to be delivered, then we need to resolve these issues around passive land ownership. And there needs to be a way to enable public bodies to actually assemble sites. So a couple of things. I was at an event that Shelter ran on compulsory purchase orders, where actually your colleagues in Glasgow City Council were talking about the work they do and how they go about it. And there's obviously a great deal of appetite. There were 80 people attending, but I think the sense is that not just that values can be falsely high, but that, as Andrew was alluding to, it's a very complex process. So we're planning to set up a community of practice on land assembly next year, and the idea is that will be partly about sharing challenges, but also sharing solutions and people learning from councils like Glasgow and Dundee that have got a track record. But we'd hope that also might have a role to play. There's a commitment by the Scottish Government to reform compulsory purchase orders, and perhaps learning from the community of practice could potentially inform that, depending on the timing. But I agree, it's a huge issue. Maybe one final thing to say on passive land ownership. I understand that in Ireland they introduced a right for councils to tax owners of unproductive vacant land. So, you know, whether that's something we can learn from when we see how effective it is.
Thank you, and I actually really like that description, passive land ownership.
I mean, I think the thing is there's no, I mean, if you think about a simple corner shop, there's no connection between, you know, a hectare of land, you know, and the rateable value of the corner shop. It doesn't not really make any, there's no parity between those at all. But then if you take the corner shop and then you flatten it and create a gap site, you pay nothing. It doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a really good way of describing it, actually. Thank you. Thanks, David, and thanks to both all three Davids actually for your reflections, and thanks to Andrew for your reflections there. That's really interesting. If anyone else would like to come in, please do. Otherwise, I'll just give you a couple of seconds. If anyone would like to come in, if Andrew's thought of what he'd like to say, please come in as well. But I just wanted to sort of give another kind of shout out for myland.scot. It's a really good resource. It's got fantastic podcasts. I find them really interesting to listen to. There's some really different stuff. There's a few things to do with kind of vacant and derelict land and different ways that they've been dealt with. And I'd highly recommend having a look on the site and listening to some of them. So I always like to give that a wee shout out because it's one of those things that I find really interesting. Andrew's got something, so I'll let Andrew come in.
Well, you did say you said I could come back in, so I will. So
Absolutely.
So actually, when David Adams in particular went there, and where I had intended to go and then forgot. But I think there's a more general issue. I mean, it is about tax, really, and David Dunlop sort of nailed it with his corner shop analogy. We have to use. So I'm clear. We have to use compulsory tools. So that's point one. Point two is we have to use these tax and fiscal tools as well. These are levers that are there, and they should be used in the public interest. So I think that we often, when we talk about our work on tax, people immediately assume, oh, you're trying to raise more money for the Scottish Government, are you? That's not what our tax work is primarily about. Our tax work is about creating levers that democratically accountable institutions, which could be local government, national government, whatever, levers that can be used to deliver public interest outcomes from land and property. And I think it's an important sort of take-home message that which is so often forgotten, that yes, of course, tax can be a way of raising revenue, but often tax is much more important a way of influencing behaviours. And frankly, that's why land values is one of the reasons why land values are so high, because land is actually a very good shelter from tax at the moment. And that I don't think can make sense in the longer term. Thanks, Ali, for letting me in.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. Thanks to everyone for your input tonight. Thanks to everyone for your reflections. It's been really interesting. Jess and I are going to have a quick look at the schedule for next year and see whether we can fit in coming back to the area, because we've obviously got the night wrong with the World Cup and a few other bits and bobs. And I know there's actually some local meetings, council meetings and stuff happening, so we had some apologies as well. So we will look at, we have actually got our schedule planned for next year, so we're just going to have a wee look and see about if there's something we can do. A reminder there in the chat box to fill in the survey. Thanks to Jess for all the links. You can see what a wealth of information there is there. Our website is a great resource for finding stuff, as is MyLand. Please do come and have a look. Please do contact us anytime. We've been a small group tonight, it's great, but you may have something that you didn't want to bring up here. What happens when we do meetings like this in real life is we finish the meeting at 8 o'clock, and then at 8:05, we're in the corner having a wee chat with somebody. That's the only thing that we find can't happen online. So if you do want to have a chat afterwards, please just contact us and let us know. And if there's a particular person you'd like to speak to, just let us know in your email or your contact, and that'll be passed to us. There we go, just right on. Jess is so good at getting all the information, and thanks very much. So please do feel free to get in touch and say, I'd really like to speak to David Adams about this, or Sally about that. That's absolutely fine. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight. It's been great. It's quality, not quantity in these meetings, so it's been really good to have a really interesting discussion. I really hope you are all warm and cozy tonight. Please stay warm and stay safe, and have an absolutely lovely Christmas and New Year when it comes. And we look forward to seeing you again either next year or very soon at other events. So thank you very, very much to the other panel members. Thank you to Andrew and David for joining me here as commissioners, and thank you very, very much to David, Stuart and Jess for giving up their evening and coming along to answer questions and support this. And thank you to all of you for attending, because it's been great, and I hope you've got something from it and been able to pick up some interesting information. So thank you all very much.